For the legacy of video games, Nintendo deserves praise, but it doesn't deserve an over amount of praise. Nintendo. They didn't create video games. They weren't the only ones that solely recreated video games, if you will. They weren't the only ones that solely rebirthed video games in the 1980s, and I'm going to explain why. It just pisses me off that all you guys seem to act like Nintendo is the most innovative game company ever, and maybe, but they weren't the innovators of everything in video games. So let's get into it. The first very bold claim from fans, and I'm a Nintendo fan myself. I'm a Nintendo fanboy as well, but I'm not an insane one. For too long, a lot of video gamers just grew up with Nintendo for the most part, so they've just been worshipping Nintendo the whole time and they don't know their video game history. The first very bold claim is that Nintendo rebirthed the video game industry and revitalized the video game industry and saved even the video game industry with the NES in the 1980s. This is only half true. What about Sega? You know, the company that no one gives a rat's ass about anymore? Now people only care about Sonic. But there was a time where people cared about not just Sonic, but also Sega as well. Sega had the Master System, which came out around the same exact time that the NES came out. Yes, it came out 1 year later, but still, that's extremely close. The NES was way more popular than the Master System in the United States. But in Europe and in Brazil, the Master System outsold the NES and was way more popular than the NES. So can't we say that both Nintendo and Sega saved the video game industry? Why is it only just Nintendo? The other parts of the world do matter as well. It's not just what happens in the United States. Also, people seem to think the Super Nintendo introduced 16-bit gaming and took things to the next level with video games. This is not true. The Sega Genesis was the reason why the Super Nintendo even exists. Sega Genesis was released in 1988 and 1989. Then afterwards, the Super Nintendo was released. So no, Sega were the ones that were the innovators of 16-bit gaming, not Nintendo. The next claim is that Nintendo invented the D-pad. I have to say, I will give credit to Nintendo for this one. That is true. This is true. Nintendo did invent the gamepad. There were things that were similar to it that came right afterwards, and maybe even before, but not really. Technically, it even came out before the NES. It was on the Game & Watch portable game systems. The next claim is that the Super Nintendo invented the shoulder buttons. And, sorry, this isn't true either. If you go back to the 7800 controller, the Atari 7800 controller, that had shoulder buttons, very similar. Also, the Atari 5200 had shoulder buttons as well. So, no, Nintendo did not invent the shoulder buttons either. But for that one, I guess I'll give Nintendo some slight extra credit, but they did not invent the right and left trigger buttons. The next claim to fame is that Nintendo invented the start button with the NES controller. Also not true. The Atari 5200 game controller had a pause button. So, no, Atari did that first. Wrong. So what about the select button? Does Nintendo get credit for that? For the NES controller? Not really, no. If you go back in time, the Atari 2600 technically had a select button. Yes, it was on the system itself, but it still existed. So no, Nintendo did not invent the select button either. But again, slight extra credit should be given, I suppose, because it's on the actual controller and not on the game system. But once again, they did not invent the select button. They innovated it, they improved upon it, but they didn't invent it, and they didn't invent all this other shit. N64 controller. People seem to claim that Nintendo invented the analog control stick. Nope, wrong again. This was the Atari 5200. Yes, those controllers sucked. Yes, they barely worked, but when they did actually work, it felt very smooth to play the game. So it was primitive, but they did invent it. N64 did not invent it, but they improved upon it, but they didn't invent it. Also, the Sega Saturn in 1996 had their 3D control pad that also had a analog control stick. But that was the same year that the N64 was released, so I guess that's like a tie, you know. One thing I will give Nintendo credit for, which seems to go ignored nowadays, and I think it's because we're desensitized to it nowadays, but the Game Boy. Nintendo, I think, did invent portable gaming. Maybe not completely, but they pretty much did, though. Because after the Game Boy was popular in 1989 and etc., then came the Atari Lynx, then came the Sega Game Gear, then came the Turbo Express, etc., etc., Neo Geo Pocket Color, And if you want to go back even further in time, they already invented portable gaming with the Game & Watch series, which came out before the Game Boy. So I have to give Nintendo a point for that. The Game Boy is probably Nintendo's biggest innovation, not all this other stuff that people are bragging about with Nintendo. Trying to go in order here, going back to the Nintendo 64, which is my favorite video game console of all time, people seem to claim, or some people at least, say that Nintendo invented 3D gaming, on a game system at least. No, that's not true either. There was 3D gaming in 1995 with the Sega Saturn and the PS1. So Nintendo did not invent 3D gaming either. And if you want to go back even further, the Atari Jaguar had a couple of 32-bit/64-bit titles in 1994 and 1995 as well. So no, the N64 didn't invent 3D gaming. 4 controller ports in front of the console. People think Nintendo invented that. No. Once again, the system everybody loves to make fun of, the Atari 5200. That was the first game console with 4 controller ports right in front. And Atari also had their game Warlords, which was 4-player. So Atari was the ones that were first beginning to have 4 players in a game. Nintendo perfected that and made it better, but they didn't invent it. On to the GameCube controller. People claim that the GameCube introduced the trigger buttons that click, the left and right buttons that click, so that it feels like more precise when you're playing a game, like a shooting game or a racing game or whatever. Well, that's not true either. The Sega Saturn had a control pad that had left and right buttons that clicked, and that was like way before the GameCube ever was released. This next thing I will give Nintendo credit for. They technically invented the Rumble Pack, or the Rumble controller, with the Nintendo 64. It really wasn't done before that, I think. So I will give Nintendo credit for that. Because I think I remember afterwards the PS1 eventually got Rumble control. And also the Sega Dreamcast as well, afterwards. The next claim is that Nintendo invented motion controls with the Wii controller back in the late 2000s. No. I would say no once again. The Sega Genesis had the activator, which you could hook up to the floor, and that was motion controls. That was back in the early 90s, so Sega invented the motion controls. Technically, if you want to go back even further, there was the Power Glove, and then there was also the U-Force contraption for the NES. But efficient-wise, the Sega Activator worked better than both the Power Glove and the U-Force combined. So Sega were the ones that really almost kind of invented that first. It was experimented with badly on the NES and then improved upon with the Sega Genesis. And then by the time the late 2000s came, Nintendo, made it even better, but Sega were the ones that really pushed it on the Sega Genesis with the Activator, which worked for a couple of games. Compare that to the U-Force, which I think only worked well for one game, and that was Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! And in that game, you could only punch. But the Activator, I think, allowed you to do a little more things. Not too much more, but still, it worked for more than just one game, though. Also, the U-Force for the NES, I think it was made by Konami, but it was licensed by Nintendo. So technically, Nintendo didn't really create the U-Force, but since it was licensed by them, I guess that sort of half counts. And then the Power Glove, well, that mostly sucked, but it was a cool idea. So no, Nintendo did not invent motion controls. Sorry, wrong again. Going back to Nintendo inventing the portable gaming thing, they still do that today with the Wii U and the Switch, So again, that really is Nintendo's biggest innovation, is portable gaming. Because that was before the PSP, before the Game Gear, and all that other fun stuff. But everything else really was not invented by Nintendo. You can say they're, innovative and that they improved on other things that were already existed, but they weren't the creators of video games, and they also didn't save the video game industry all by themselves. That myth has to die. It needs to be burned forever. Sega and Nintendo both reinvented video games, and they both saved the video game industry. Wasn't just Nintendo and Mario. Anyway, so I love Nintendo. I mean, I used to love Nintendo, right? But, you know, I'm just saying, this is my little rant video about how annoying people are overly praising Nintendo and shit. You guys need to learn your video game history. I mean, I love old video games. I can talk about it till I'm blue in the face, but just stop acting like Nintendo are like the gods of gaming. They're not. They never were. They're one of the gods of gaming, but they didn't create video games. Like, come on, guys, really. Anyway, please like and subscribe. Please leave some comments down below if you think I'm a dumbass or if you think I'm a genius, or somewhere in the middle. Let's argue, let's debate, let's talk about it, let's compliment each other, let's insult each other, let's have some fun. My name is SuperPat98, and thank you for watching.